Thanks. So yeah, we're talking about inspecting violations and giving notices, and meeting with violators. And so Keegan is here to help me record the session as well as answer questions in the chat, or we can also talk afterwards, and also keep people on mute just to try to keep down the background noise. And then we will have a brief break in the middle because this is a 2-hour session of me just talking. So we'll have a break. And then if you want the 2 CECs, you'll need to be on for at least 45 minutes of each section and then answer the 2 poll questions that we'll have. And I think kind of the message of this class, at least part of it, is that violations are not always black and white. There's a lot of judgment and nuance that goes into it. So we'll go into that and what is floodplain management. Our whole goal here is to reduce vulnerability to flood risk in our environment. And so if we know where the high risk areas are, we can develop in a way that is meant to prevent that type of flood risk. So we can make smart development and have these reasonable decisions to protect families and homes and businesses, which is our overall goal here. So sometimes, yes, floodplain management is like utilized or even weaponized, I guess, in a way to complain against one another. So we come across this quite a bit where neighbors are complaining about each other and they use floodplain management to demonize each other, perhaps. But a lot of our violation complaints come through this type of relationship where we have neighbors that are disputing, but in whichever way that it comes to us, development that has occurred inside the special flood hazard area where ordinances apply that don't meet the minimum requirements of our local floodplain regulations, or usually that's either a resolution or an ordinance. Whichever way it comes to us, we still have to deal with it. And that's just one of the common ways that it comes through is complaints, but that type of development that hasn't gone through these required reviews and permitting processes are vulnerable to flood damage. It could make insurance more expensive, and FEMA could ultimately put sanctions on the community. And there's a whole list of things that come with FEMA sanctions, but that's very rare. Usually what we try to do is correct these violations and work with FEMA, and it doesn't usually come to this, but they could put on suspension, ultimately suspending the community from the program. So that's not what we want to do. We don't want to suspend communities from the program, and we want them to continue to participate. So we try to get retroactive compliance with that. And development really means any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. So that means really anything, any place that's in the special flood hazard area. That could include, structures. So we have like buildings, houses, non-residential buildings. It could include levees, levee systems, and then mining, dredging, and filling kind of all fall into one category as far as how I think of non-structural buildings, but that's the kind of thing that could require state permitting. But the idea here is development is any man-made change. So it could mean buildings, it could mean fences, it could mean carports or even playgrounds, that kind of stuff. So any man-made change here. And then these are the larger projects as far as levees, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, all of that. So it's just meant to give you an overall view of what we consider development. And then, of course, floodplain development permits. So any development, as we looked at any man-made change in the special flood hazard area, as far as like the base flood or the 100-year base flood area, that's going to require a local permit from the community. And so we do promote as much as we can having communities have this type of signage, have outreach to let people know that floodplain development permits are required. And a lot of what we see here, as far as Kansas, and I know this is different in different areas, but we see a lot of accessory structures come up unpermitted. And so when we do community assistance visits, when we look over a community's entire flood program, a lot of what comes out is the sorry, accessory accessory structures. So you have businesses like this that will just kind of ship out accessory structures and they're not permitted, and then people aren't aware that they're supposed to be permitted. And then we do have exceptions for accessory structures that they can be put at grade if they're only for parking and storage, and then they can be wet flood proofed, which means they have flood openings on at least two sides within 1 foot of grade. So they're not more than 1 foot higher than grade. And then it allows floodwaters to move freely throughout that building. Um, Otherwise, they have to be elevated. So um, this happens a lot, and so we recommend doing outreach to um, we recommend doing outreach to businesses that ship out these types of structures. But this is a common issue that we have in our um, community assistance visits where we look at the entire flood program. And then that's supposed to be within 600 square feet. And you can see that in FEMA's bulletin. Um, and so if it's not properly anchored or wet flood proofed in that way, it can easily become debris in the event of a flood. So that's why we look into these things. And then some communities have said to me that they don't require permitting within a certain size, and that doesn't really apply to floodplain regulations. So some communities will like not permit it if it's too small, like within 200 square feet or something like that. Um, any structure in the special flood hazard area needs to be permitted. It needs to be reviewed for this reason that it could become debris. And so that's something to look out for. And it's not something that may come across your desk necessarily. They kind of just pop up. So it's something to watch out for if possible. I don't think you can catch all of them, but it is something to be aware of for sure. And that's within 600 square feet is what we have in our model ordinances, what most people have in their ordinances, and then um, it used to be 400, now it's 600. And so what gives you the right? I've had a lot of people really upset with me, saying like what they can and can't do on their own property. And it's like, yes, you do own the property, but also the community that you live in has certain rules about what is and is not permissible still. It's not like a free-for-all, even if you own the property. So we do have floodplain authorizing statutes, obviously. So through the state, um, we're a home rule state. And so basically through the state, the communities can enact regulations that allow them to regulate their floodplains. And so that's the top rule. And then Kansas administrative regulations. So we do have other state laws that apply to floodplains that are not part of the NFIP. Um, they're a little bit different, and so there are state rules that apply to
What'd you say?
floodplains as far as like
Are you talking to me?
sorry, I heard like some background. Um so there are state permits that apply to like floodplain fill. So if you put fill in a floodplain, that might require a state permit. If you do any kind of obstructions to a waterway, that would also require a state permit. And then if you do require that, they're also going to look at the other state and federal agencies that might also require floodplains. So for right now, we have the um, Coordination Act that has look at these other state and federal um, rules that apply. And then we also have other things that are not floodplain specific, but could apply to either, like community abatement. So there's statutes about like dangerous structures and other dangers of health and environment, those kinds of things that could potentially apply to floodplains, but also that communities can enact that would help them abate abate the issue. So they would, fix the problem and then put a lien against the property. So there's kind of this crossover with like KDHE. There's not supposed to be septic tanks in the floodplain, and so that's part of Bolton 4-2, and it's up to the sanitarians to enforce that, and then insurance proceeds and abatement, as I explained. So yeah, KSA 12758, basically. This has been brought up to me. It's basically an exception for certain acts that apply to alteration of a building or provide for a change in use, that kind of stuff. And this has been brought up before as reason why like floodplain enforcement couldn't be done. But it does say except for floodplain regulations. So it's not exempt from floodplain regulations, and that's kind of an important thing that people tend to miss. But it gets pulled out from time to time that, certain things are exempt, but it's not exempt from floodplain rules, which is what we care about. So insurance proceeds ordinance, basically this is kind of it is convoluted. A lot of insurance things are convoluted, but basically they wouldn't get the full payout of the insurance that's due to them unless they are compliant with what you're asking for based on your ordinance or your resolution. And this doesn't really get brought up a lot, at least to me, but it is something to be aware of that this is another tool that you have to try to get people to comply. Um, oops. So this is just another incentive tool that you have that could help compliance. That you have the insurance proceeds ordinance. Um, they won't get the full payout unless they comply. And so really, when does enforcement start? And there's a lot of ways that this can come in. There's a lot of ways that this comes to me, like property owners call me, community officials call me, I get calls from the bank sometimes. And it just depends. So, when does enforcement start? If FEMA notifies me, I start a violation file. Um, Whether it's to do, mostly it is to do with letters of map change. So that would be your LOMA or your LOMAR or the LOMAR dash F, which is based on fill. Basically, when they're legally trying to come out of the floodplain and FEMA has to review that information. So yes, that's one of the ways that potential violations come to me. In anonymous complaints, as we started in the beginning, like a neighbor complaint or just a citizen complaint in general, um, that's one of the ways. Like I said, a community official will call me because they have questions. As I said, we do community visits. So when I sit down with a community official and we go through the whole program, there's these problem properties, and because I look through aerial imagery, I see new development, and then I have to ask questions about that. Like, was this permitted? Like, what exactly happened? And then I do a visit to the property itself as well. I do a site visit just to photograph and document changes over the last 5 years. So yes, and then as a property official, or sorry, as a community official, yes, you should be visiting a property during construction. And then, of course, as I've been speaking about, when I do an audit, which I try not to use that word because I know people don't like it, but it's an audit. It shouldn't be scary. What we're trying to do is just assess your floodplain program and go through it and assist where we can. It's not a punishment of a community. We just want to make sure that we can help you improve your floodplain program. So yes, as an audit, any of these ways a potential violation could come into view, just random people reporting it to us, and all we do is just reach out and try to assist community officials. Um, and we have a lot of turnover and a lot of people that aren't familiar with floodplain management, so we just try to assist them and give technical assistance as best as we can. It's not a bad thing. We want to make sure that these people are going to be safe, reasonably safe from flooding. So that's our whole goal. Um, of course, there's a little bit of nuance here. These are things that we've been told that, yeah, I can't do floodplain management because I'm busy. I don't want to upset people. And yes, it does get political at times. That's a difficult um, part to manage the like floodplain management. We get this all a lot. Um, all we want to do is improve things as best as we can. I know it can be political. I know it can be scary. Like the Violators, my mayor's brother. Yeah. Um, it's not easy. So what we try to do is just improve things as much as we can within reason. Um, it's federal law, so you're supposed to be enforcing these things. You're supposed to enforce your ordinance, but it's not easy. I know you don't want to upset anybody, um, and we deal with this a lot, but um, there are ways that we can deal with this within reason and within the law. But we hear these reasons a lot. If it's our mapping, it's our fault, sure. I've had people tell me that I'm policing their property a little bit too much. There's no procedures in place. That's definitely an issue if there's no procedures in place, but we have heard that. sometimes it's a very long time between when we've mapped them and since we've met. And, we've been working on our program a lot to reach out to these communities that we haven't spoken with very much. Yeah, sometimes people don't believe they're in the mapped floodplain. It's like, yeah, well, but you are in the mapped floodplain. So it's difficult. I understand. It's not easy. Um, but definitely look at the aerial photos and our GIS before we visit a property. Absolutely. Um, if there was a complaint or any type of information like that came in, the first thing I would do is definitely look at our effective floodplain viewer and just make sure we're in the floodplain, and then look at the zone. What are we in? And then I would also look at where we are as far as floodplain mapping, where we are. Sometimes new data can be used as best effective, and so it's a good idea to just get an overall view of the entire property and where we are as far as mapping and effective mapping and the position of the floodplain in relationship to a proposed project or that kind of thing. It's a good idea to just have an overall view of all of these things. And I think sometimes people don't think about mapping projects. So it could be a property that's in the middle of a new mapping project that might take them out completely. And sometimes we can use that as best effective. I mean, we're always going to take the most restrictive, but it's always good to, keep a perspective of, what's this property going to look like in 5 years if we have a mapping project, that let's take that into perspective and versus the effective. So it's look at the entire thing. And then of course location maps, it basically goes in line with what I was just talking about. Is just having a perspective of where this is in relationship to a floodplain, and a potential mapping project or a potential letter of map change. So maybe it's eligible for a letter of map amendment, and then that would take it out completely. And that kind of resolves the issue potentially. Just there's so many factors that go into it, but if we look at these different factors, it will um, tell us some different stories. So like, and this is what I do when I do the um, community assistance visits. I look at this type of imagery, and this is a little bit older, so we try not to go back more than 5 years. But this is the kind of thing that I look for when I'm setting up a community assistance visit, is like, um, okay, this building is completely new, um, and everything has changed. So we want to investigate a little bit further, like what has happened here, what work has gone on for this particular building, and this one's new. So we want to make sure that it's in compliance, um, potentially asking for the permit. We're going to look at the finished elevation certificate and that kind of documentation. And that's basically the purpose of the community assistance visit, is that we're trying to assess that new development is built in compliance and that you've reviewed it and you've been able to see this, you're aware of it, and you have that type of documentation. And if not, we try to do it retroactively. But again, it's not meant to be a punishment, it's meant to help communities better assess their own uh, new development. And so this is another tool that we have. This is the imagery way back. And so I use Google Earth, and I use this as well to help me look at different satellite imagery that's been taken over the last couple of years to look at new development. And so this is just another tool that I have. Um, and this one may have images that are not on Google Earth. And then, of course, whenever you are permitting things, keep them on file permanently. Um, and that's something that we do meticulously at the state, but you need to review files and keep building permit records on file permanently. And that way we can look back and see what has been done because there's, multiple reasons why we would need to look at it. Um, One being, uh, has someone done a permit in the last 6 months? And so we need to keep track of substantial improvement. So over the course of a calendar year, you need to keep track of improvements. And that's just the basic. A lot of communities have adopted a much higher range at 5 years. And so if an improvement has cost 50% or more of the market value of this building, then it's considered a substantial improvement and they have to be in compliance with the current regulations. So that's something important to keep track of. And so FEMA recommends keeping track of these things geographically. So by property records, and that way you can see when was the last time you did an improvement. And if it exceeds that amount, you need to be in compliance. And so a lot of communities have, different systems, but a lot of structures are already built in compliance with the current base flood elevation. So sometimes there might not be anything that you need to do. Um, it just depends on the work that they've done. Uh, we also recommend being in good relationship with your appraiser. If you're not the appraiser, I know we have some appraisers that are floodplain administrators, but if you're not, they would have access to that type of records, and appraiser property tax records have those types of dates of additions or other improvements, other constructions, and then just keeping in mind that flood maps change over time. So if they were in compliance with the last map, but maybe the base flood elevation went up, if they did a substantial improvement, they might not be in compliance anymore. So just being aware of that, having a good relationship with the appraiser, and then just being communicative with the property owner is a good um, rule of practice. And then if you are pretty certain that someone has a violation, whether knowingly or not, a lot of people do this unintentionally. So it's not trying to have that type of like argumentative relationship, but if you are documenting a violation, and I do this quite frequently, is having a good establishing shot. So being on public property, so we don't ever we try to avoid as much as we can any like trespassing issues. So from public property, you can get these establishing shots, and I have a lot on here about trespassing issues, but we don't want to do that. We want to stay on public property unless we have specific permission or we follow the procedures in the ordinance about notification within 5 days. So there's a lot about that, but basically what we're trying to do is establish where this was taken, when it was taken, and having these large photos that show exactly where we are. So we have landmarks and that kind of thing. Um, so in this particular picture, we're showing the fire hydrant, so it can kind of prove where we are. Um, and then it's potentially, I think things may have changed over the years, but you may want to use a device that's work specific, something that you might not mind being confiscated, a wide angle photo that shows as much of the property as possible, and then unaltered, raw, unedited image because it could potentially end up in court. So that's the kind of end all and be all of floodplain management is that you end up in court, which hopefully not, but it's the the final possibility. So that's why we get things like a fire hydrant in this establishing shot. Um, a street sign is potentially the best landmark of all, as in this photo that shows you right exactly where we are on that corner. And that way it's undisputed. Again, we want to keep all the metadata, don't alter anything. And in this case, the house was flooded and the floodplain administrator was doing substantial damage assessments. So you can see all the belongings, the furnishing, and that type of stuff being brought out. That's good evidence. Substantial damage assessment is its own topic, so we do have recorded training on that if you're interested in that topic in particular. But as far as doing substantial damage assessments, this would be a very good establishing shot. And as far as assessments, looking at that kind of stuff, the furniture and other belongings being taken out. And so it might be difficult to see, but right behind this house is a riparian area. So the stream channel's right behind there. And so they took a lot of photos, and that's helpful for substantial damage assessments as well as any further potential violations that may follow that. And so this, where do you stand when you're taking the picture? You want to stand on a public property area. Um, so public property, it, the laws here are a little bit interesting in the way that, I found out about them. So there's a thing called curtilage. Curtilage. So that means the surrounding areas of the property, like the driveway and the yard, are actually protected under the same laws as you would be violating as a breaking and entering. So if I broke into this house, I'd be committing as much crime as I was just standing in the lawn or on the driveway. So you don't want to do that. So stay on the sidewalk, stay on the streets or any other public property. Just be aware that those areas are protected the exact same as if you were doing a breaking and entering, which is wild to me. But under the Fourth Amendment, we can't have unlawful search and seizure. Um, and so pictures that you take in that way could possibly incriminate you, but at the very least invalidate any um, you know, investigation that you're doing into unlawful development. So yeah, it's concerning the unreasonable searches. That's where it's founded. So just be aware of that. I don't even leave my car anymore when I do community assistance visits. Especially like in rural areas, it can be a little bit scary. Uh, so we don't want to do that. And again, this goes back to the Boston Tea Party, the Stamp Act, that tariffs were on all goods that were being imported. And when they increased prices on that, British soldiers were supposed to enforce that by breaking in and doing searches on unstamped goods. And so that's where this comes from. So just a little bit of history on that. Yeah, these are the kinds of signs that you might see in rural areas, and we don't want to infringe on those, and we don't want to put ourselves in danger. So, we always recommend working in pairs when possible. Even if you're not going to get out of your car, even like me, if you can bring somebody, if you do have to do an in-person search, then you might consider a police escort if that's possible. Just stay safe. None of this is worth putting yourself in danger. We're trying to keep people from putting themselves in danger. So, um, just something to be aware of. Don't trespass. But there are provisions in the ordinance that if you've put up notification that you would be entering the property within 10, or I think it's 5 days, so you put it in within 5 days that you can do that. I, it's still not super safe. I'm just gonna put that out there. Of course, you have your own common sense, but if we can, work in pairs and don't put yourself in danger. And yes, establishing shots like this, we can do most of this work without ever trespassing or having to enter anybody's property. Substantial damage is different. Damaged properties, you are required to go inside, and there's procedures for that. But just for your run-of-the-mill violations and inspections, we don't normally have to do that. So this is a good establishing shot, and this, so we can say like, hey, this is your property, right? Yes, yes, it is. And then this is your shed that you put up but didn't get permits for. And it shouldn't be that difficult. We should be able to just, retroactively permit this without any issue. Just make sure that it's anchored, made of flood damage resistant material, it's used only for parking and storage, and that kind of thing. There's criteria are laid out very clearly in the ordinance. All right. And then the slide is about potentially making sure that you have maybe just a device like a digital camera or a cheap cell phone that you have just for work uses, just for violations issues in case that it was confiscated for um, court purposes. So they might want to see the photos. They might want to see this device, and they're very inexpensive. I have one of these for just doing inspections myself. I haven't used it in a while, but it's something to consider in case it gets confiscated as evidence. It's just for violations or substantial damage inspections specifically. Definitely take a lot of photos as much as you can. We're in the digital age. Take as many photos as you want to. We don't have to like go and get them developed or anything. Um, Now, in the case, and this is in the extreme that you have to go to court, you would have the attorney look at those photos and then they would choose the ones that are going to be used in court that you release as evidence. So just think about that. Definitely don't use selfie sticks, and I think I have a couple slides after this as to where the line is as far as investigating things. And then definitely save the metadata. We're not going to manipulate or Photoshop any of these pictures. They're just going to be there in their raw media on the drive. So we're not going to edit anything. So go through it with your city attorney. If you're, a floodplain administrator, you can go through it with your attorney. You can explain what's good and bad about it. and then they can choose what's good, what proves your case, or whatever. Um, and then, yeah, we don't. So there's this thing about privacy fences. It's like privacy fences are meant to provide reasonable privacy. And so if we violate that intent, then, we've violated the Fourth Amendment. So in the bottom right picture, you can see, I'm walking on the sidewalk and I can see that there's a new shed there that I know has not been permitted. And like even on the left, I can see the roof of a shed that has not been permitted. And that's fine. I can take pictures like this, but we can't, go over the privacy fence in that way if you see it. So, don't go over a privacy fence because then they're saying, you might be violating the Fourth Amendment, where a privacy fence is meant to provide reasonable privacy. Um, and the same thing with a drone. You can't fly drones over things to violate people's privacy. But what's interesting is like if I was fixing a light fixture for the city, if I was fixing a street light and I happen to see something like that, then I'm allowed to take a picture of it. It's strange. Just basically the law is around the intention to violate a person's privacy. So if I saw it from a street light while I was working, that's okay, but I can't fly a drone over people's property. So I hope that makes sense. But just remembering that the intent is the privacy. So as long as we don't violate that, but as you can see, like in these couple of pictures, I can clearly see over the fence without even getting close to it that there's been new development. And that's something that I can ask about. That's something I can cite as a potential violation. Okay, there's new development here. You're in the special flood hazard area. Is this anchored? Is it wet flood proofed? And you need a permit. So, is this a violation? I mean, clearly this was not permitted. Um, the the materials are clearly not wet flood proofed or flood damage resistant. So when we see new development in the special flood hazard area, we are able to, cite it and be like, hey, what is this? You have to have permits to build here. There's definitely no flood openings. It technically maybe it could be on the other side of the structure that we can't see, but it's definitely not anchored. It still needs a permit. We still have to validate these things, but it's definitely a floodplain violation, but it also may be other department violations. So like the building department, the health department. So you can team up with these other departments in your community to go at a violation like this and be like, hey, this is a violation of many of our community codes, not just floodplain. So definitely doubtful that it has a permit. Um, and then you might have something like this. It doesn't have flood openings. It's not anchored. But in this case, it's not a violation because it was fathered in. It's almost, sorry, grandfathered in. It's over 40 years old. So at the time that it was built and placed, it was not required to have flood openings. It's a pre-firm structure. It's been maintained over time, but technically um, in um, it's not in it's not really a violation, but if there was a substantial improvement, then it would have to come into compliance, which means it's only used for parking and storage, and it would have to have flood openings and be anchored. So there's a little bit of difference. There's a little bit of nuance. And that's a large part of why we look at imagery is for new development. We're not trying to dive back like 20 or 30 years. We only look back about 5 years to try to make sure that development is in compliance. And then, of course, doing the outreach is really important. So we recommend sending out letters to residents that are in the special flood hazard area, if you're able to, and just let them know that, you're in the special flood hazard area, you're supposed to have, you know, specific permitting for any development that you do on this property. Um, and that technically any development without that required documentation is a violation. And a lot of people just don't know that. They're not violating intentionally, they just are unaware. Not only that, but there's state permitting, as I mentioned before, for fill in the floodplain and any work, basically, or for the most part, in the direct stream, the stream bed, and they will check around, but there could be U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permitting that's required. So doing outreach will help you avoid any potential violations, and that that's really a key part of it because once a violation has happened in those areas, it's a lot harder to correct, and you would have to correct it with these other either state or federal agencies, and that makes it even more difficult. So you've discovered a violation, you know this person is in violation. Um, what can we do about it in the enforcement process? So I, I haven't really gotten a clear answer, and it's been different from different communities about what they're allowed and not allowed to do. But hopefully, what you'd be allowed to do is a stop work order for things, development that's ongoing, that hasn't been permitted. And I haven't gotten a lot of answers on how this works exactly, but different building departments, and it can be confusing because it's so different, nuanced from every different community. But hopefully, you would have the power to issue a stop work order when work is in progress and there's no permits, or conditions of the permit are not being followed, which does happen. And I feel like this is where a lot of the coordination between the different departments comes in, because a lot of times the city clerk would be the floodplain administrator, and then they'd be a little bit separate from the building department. And so it's like the building department needs to know when work is going on in the floodplain and how those permits should be operating in conjunction with one another, ideally. Um, and that's why I bring that up, is like sometimes like a violation has been issued to a person at the same time that they got their certificate of occupancy. And so it's like those things shouldn't happen. It's like you shouldn't issue the OCC unless I've given my, permit. So there's that kind of relationship there, but hopefully you'd be able to stop the work if there's ongoing work that has not been permitted. Um, and so it doesn't need to be a special forum. It can just be the community letterhead, like an official letter from a community official that notices the violation. It is going to specifically cite why it's a violation and of what ordinance, and it's easier to fix this when it hasn't been completed. So definitely don't delay. This is something to do immediately. Um, yeah, if construction is taking place, and then what I was saying, the violator gets notified of the violation, and you should probably use certified mail. Um, there have been issues, I guess, with just using a mailing affidavit. But what we're trying to emphasize here is just keeping a good paper trail of, okay, I notified them this, like at this date, on this date, and then, keeping that on file so that you can document that they've been notified, like, hey, this needs a permit, other things, because the eventuality that we're talking about, like the most extreme account, is that you would go to court. And this doesn't happen very often. For the most part, from what I've seen, it's just most people are unaware that they've um, have violated a local ordinance, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know I needed to do all this." And that's kind of where the outreach comes in. But also, if you end up with an adversarial person who does not want to comply, that you document all of these things. And there's just an example of an affidavit of mailing. It's not, you know, a terrible option. It's just something that we've noticed. And so the notary republic witnesses you mailing that letter. It is a little bit cheaper and easier than certified mail, potentially. Um, Although the property owner can claim that they never received it, you know, that kind of stuff. So, um, decisions, but also that I think that's where your written administrative procedures might come in. If you have written administrative procedures that say how you're going to notify potential violators and like how you do that communication, that can really come into play, especially if you hopefully not ever end up in court. It's like, I did this, I did that, I followed the procedures. Here's a copy of our written procedures that we do when we, experience a potential violation. That will help hold you up in court if you ever end up in court. Again, hopefully not. But so when you first end up with a violation, so either however you discovered it, kind of like what we talked about, like you discovered it yourself or someone reported it because they're an angry neighbor, or someone else reported it because, they think it could cause a flooding issue on their property or whatever. However you discovered it, we want to start with a letter of allegation. And so this is not supposed to be accusatory, but it's like, hey, we've become aware of new development or potential new development on your property. And so we'd like to discuss it and just make sure that it's properly permitted because you're in the special flood hazard area. So we have the location and the nature of the supposed, again, alleged violation, and we make that clear. And then say it's an accessory structure, we're gonna put all that information in there. And then because you're in the special flood hazard area, we have this section in our ordinance about accessory structures and what specifics need to be fulfilled for it to be compliant. And then possibly we could fine you, and there is a section, or there should be a section in your ordinance, at least there are in the most recent ones, about fines, and we have like a limit of $500 per day, I believe. Anyways, that rarely happens. It's not supposed to be threatening. We just want to make sure everything's, compliant. We want to make sure it's anchored. It's not going to become debris in the incidence of a flood. So what other actions could be taken against them if they didn't fix it, if they don't address this? Again, that shouldn't be the focus of the letter. The focus should be, we think something's happening, what's going on? That should be the overall message. And then we want to meet with you, or we want to get this documentation that your new structure or whatever it is compliant, and then try not to make it too technical. Try to be, I would say, a little bit friendly about it, because this is the first letter. The second letter is going to be a little bit more serious, but we don't want to use acronyms. Don't say BFE. We want to spell it out, spell everything out, and then cite where in the ordinance the performance standards are for this type of development and what the enforcement could be. And then we need to permit this. We want to generate action on this. And sometimes this can help you fix a violation before it even becomes a problem. You can motivate a person like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I needed to do this. I will meet with you. It's an alleged violation, and we could not locate a permit for this. Um, Try to set up a meeting, let them know when you're expecting to like come and view everything, like when you might inspect this. Um, and so I think this kind of serves as notification that I would like to, or I will come to your property to look at this. Definitely be on time with any meetings. You don't want to upset them that way. Um, and then some people will either come and apply for a permit or they will remove the violation because they were just unaware. And then the problem has resolved itself, hopefully. That's the best outcome that we have. And so sometimes it can be confusing to know where to send the letter, because people rent, right? And so you want to send the letter to the owner of the record of the property. So you would check with the Register of Deeds with the county. You can also request a limited certificate of title through the attorney. Um, why not just the person that's living there? As I said, they might just be a tenant. So we're looking for the actual owner of the property. The same with the lien, if you have a lien on that property. Um, and then again, just consideration of either a mailing affidavit or certified mail, just to make sure that you have, the documentation that this was sent and or received. And then you do have um, we do have a finding business address, finding the person who's the representative agent of a particular property, who may not be there, but is a person that's authorized to receive um, mail for that property. So we do have this if you need to look it up, the Kansas Business Center. Yeah, and then another. It still might be a little bit convoluted because we kind of point this out, like the corporation company incorporated is kind of a mouthful of nothing, as Steve would say. But it might take a little bit of research, but you should be able to find that person. And then don't stop until you find a person to send it to. And of course, we'll look at the how to structure a violation letter. Um, let's see, how many slides do we have? We have a couple slides. I think, Keegan, we could probably come back to these slides. It's been an hour, so I thought we might take a 5-minute break and then I'll try not to go over the 2-hour thing. But if you want to launch the first poll question. Great. Thanks. So which types of activity constitute development in the floodplain? Um,
Looks like we've also got a question in the chat. Will there be a copy of the slides and the recording afterwards sent out to everybody?
oh yeah, of course. We post everything to YouTube and then I'll send a follow-up email with the slides as well as like a follow-up survey.
Great.
But
Is
yeah,
that what you were looking for, Cynthia? Great. Okay.
yeah, absolutely. Definitely try to send everything out. So I'll go back a few slides, but if you guys want to stop for 5 minutes, geez, what time is it? It's exactly 2 o'clock. So if you guys want to come back at 2:05 and we'll pick back up, sorry for being a little long-winded. And if you want the CEC, if you want the certificate for the two CECs, then I you do need to answer the poll question, and then we'll review that and I'll send those out. But yeah, we'll take a 5 minute break and we'll be back at 2:05. Thanks. Hey, Kagan. Um, I guess everyone's done with the poll, right?
Okay. Do you, yeah, I'll end that. Do you want the results shared or just put away?
Yeah, we can share the results. Hopefully everyone's back. Sorry,
Okay,
I was almost
I'll
by
give you.
myself. Yeah, so the answer is all of the above. So anything, even as minute as roof maintenance would consist of floodplain management and like development. And the reason why we would look at something like roof maintenance, and why I put it in there is because it could potentially be, re-shingling is fine, something that you could exempt, but also if someone did a complete roof replacement, that could consist of a substantial improvement. And so that's why we look at these things and why we permit such small things that could potentially not be that dramatic, but it also could be, and then we don't want to miss that. And so I guess I will go back a couple slides because I went on a little bit long on the first part. Um, okay, sorry. Here's where we were. So, a violation letter, as my predecessor, Steve, as some as you may or may not have known him, is like a BLT. There should be a good structure to a violation letter. And so our opening part is the greeting. And again, we don't want to be too aggressive. We just want to allege what has happened. So we're going to greet them. We're going to explain why we're writing, what could potentially be a violation and why. And then we're going to cite that from our ordinance. We take out that citation. We request to meet with them, or maybe even just talk with them on the phone and just be like, can we talk about this potential development? And then what could maybe possibly happen? And that's, I guess, the bacon layer. What could potentially happen if we don't fix this as far as like community enforcement? Again, pe people can be very resistant to this type of conversation, so I like to tread lightly as much as possible. Like, here's why it's a problem, and here's what could happen. And like, I don't want to do that. I'd rather resolve this without, going to court or whatever. Um, and then you do have a right to appeal, and we'll get into that a little bit. Um, and then just try to give them a deadline, typically 30 days. And we do have this template allegation letter, and we do have the second letter as well as templates on our website available under NFIP resources. So um, just trying to give people a set timeline, which again is usually 30 days, and then a conclusion. Yeah, thank you for reading this. Just thanking them for their time and attention, basically. Um, So hopefully out of this you would get your um, goals completed. Basically just these letters. Yeah, and so we'll get a little bit more into it. So here's kind of like a bad example. We put this out as a bad example of like what not to do. For first, there's no greeting really. There's just like a violation in all caps and bold. And it doesn't say why necessarily. It does describe the property, but it doesn't really have a citation of the ordinance in there or why. It says, say you're in violation of number 25 through 10, whatever, the resolution for the community, and their floodplain regulations, but it doesn't really explain why or how. It's not very friendly, I would say. And I mean, I can send this out as part of the follow-up, but it doesn't really help the situation. It does say of what resolution you're in violation of, but it doesn't give a very specific area. And what you want to do with these is give a very specific citation about accessory structures, maybe about residential structures. You don't want to just give the entire resolution away. Um, and it doesn't really request a meeting either. It just says like contact us, but it doesn't give a specific timeline. I mean, it does, but 30, I think my point's getting across here. It's not very specific necessarily, and it's not very like, it's very accusatory. It's very aggressive. And so, um, yes, we do want to explain the consequences, but we also want to deliver it, within a way that's not in your face, and just like a very generic room to come to. It's just it's not very inviting. And that's not the kind of relationship that we want to have with property owners. If I'm a community official and I'm regulating the floodplain, I want to be very communicative about where those areas are, and I want to be very inviting about, let's talk about this. Let's see what we can do here. It's not supposed to be this aggressive. And so that's kind of why we use this as a not great example. Um, we do have examples on our resources site, as I said. Sorry, I get a little excited. So you should send a first letter, and then if you don't get a response after 30 days, then send a follow-up letter. Um, that is perhaps maybe a little bit more aggressive, more explanatory about those different consequences that you might see, but kind of just depends on what kind of property owner that you're working with. So you look at the violations section of your ordinance and what provisions are set there, because you might end up having to enter the property. Have I done this myself? No, not necessarily. Um, I don't know. I've worked with a lot of floodplain administrators. I'm not going to say that I did this myself. And in fact, I've been threatened while still on public property. So I might caution you on entering private property. It can be scary, even if you have official permission, that doesn't necessarily protect you. So I would, you know, follow your instincts. Don't just necessarily like don't just enter private property. Um, it can be scary. And again, written administrative procedures can really help you. Um, definitely, definitely have written administrative procedures. If you have it written out like that, it can help protect you, and it can help keep things consistent. If you follow the exact same process every time, um, look at your other community departments. Look at their violations sections. What does it say that they can do? When can they enter property? And then definitely keep them consistent. Like if they're going to update their procedures, like we need to be um, consistent in what we're saying and when, because violations could cross over between floodplain management and other departments. So that's something to keep in mind. And then if, they were violating different departments at the same time, which is very likely between like building and floodplain management and I don't know, other departments, you could put it all in one violation letter and then let them follow due process that way because we always have to allow for due process. So, um, this is the example of what we have for Article 6 under violations. We have the right to do inspections, and it might be hard to see, but if we can't get explicit permission, we will affix a copy of the notice within a minimum of 5 days prior to entry. And so this is important because we have to have some kind of process like this because even the police can't, do search or entry um, without that type of right. So we need to make clear that we have this permission um, for this specific purpose. And then documentation, violation and notices, fines and consequences. Again, this is where we run into trouble. Um, and then abatement. Abatement is, if you haven't read through the Kansas laws, we do have abatement provisions. So a community could pay for someone to get rid of a situation that could be construed as a nuisance or something on a person, and then have that lien against their property. Um, and I haven't seen a lot of this used. I haven't seen a lot of this utilized, unfortunately, even though we do have the legal wherewithal to enact it. It doesn't get used a lot, but it is there. If you want to go and look through not only floodplains, it doesn't just apply to floodplains, but like all property, and then abatement lien, where that gets put against your own property. Um, so it's something to look into. It doesn't get used very much, but um, I think because of the local politics type situation, but it is there as far as legality. And then Fifth and 14th Amendment contain a due process language. So people can protest your decisions. However, FEMA views um, variances very strictly as far as what is allowed and what's not. Um, as far as like what content should be used. And so that's where we fall with our due process. So we give them the first letter, and then we give them the second letter after 30 days, and that is a reasonable opportunity to correct a situation, which I mentioned is typically 30 days. And then you should have at least two minimum written notices before proceeding on. And so you should definitely be working with your either community or county attorney, the attorney on what the appropriate process should be, because they're all different. And if you go to court, you should definitely make sure that you're in line with the attorney and with the community leadership, because I've seen a lot of situations where that has come into play. and where maybe someone there didn't agree, or whatever the case may be, just make sure that you're all on the same page. As far as fines or litigation. And again, going to court is the very last thing that happens in floodplain management, and we don't want it to get there, but it does happen. Um, Another thing is making sure the violator knows that they can file an appeal. So that's why that section about variances is in the letter, is making sure that they know that they can appeal legally, and that's their due process. And as I mentioned, FEMA has very strict rules about what constitutes a valid variance appeal, and we have to think about a lot of things. Um, and so basically, the Supreme Court has ruled that due process, the clause of the 14th Amendment, prevents state governments from infringing on the right to privacy. So we have it, and that's why we have at least two written notices and that appropriate amount of time, and we don't trespass. Which I stand behind, you know. Those are good policies to have. You know, we're not trying to trespass or anything. We do have these templates available, as I mentioned, and it's just a good way to, you know, start to structure a violation letter or an allegation letter. So it has the entire layout, their name and property, our um, complaint, or that someone was complaining, and then why it's a violation, this part of the ordinance, and then it's alleged that you may have done this or done that. And then if you look at the bottom left paragraph, you know, you can avoid these situations by correcting a violation, by providing documentation, or removing it. And then, of course, the second letter is a little bit different. So definitely make copies of that. Yes, please send that to us if you can. Um, and it might be um, an incentive for people to comply with your regulations if you send it to us or copy us on it so that they know that the state's aware. I mean, we do keep copies of these things and we are aware of violations. It's not like we can really do anything, but sometimes people are more incentivized if we're copied. And we're always here to support you as much as we can. I can definitely tell you what the requirements are, and I talk to the public as well about what the requirements are. Um, and then we have our state regulations that are not quite the same as the NFIP. And I've mentioned this a few times, is our state permits are for um, stream obstructions and any watercourse divergencies. So anytime you're working in the stream, or if you add fill to the floodplain, usually we have to permit that. And our stream obstructions team does check the other federal requirements, like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is a common one that they have to get other permits from. So we still have that compact where we check all these other agencies, including federal, for now, um, including like KDHE and the EPA for right now. That could change. So these are the first steps. So what we do is become aware of these potential violations. It may or may not be a violation. We have to look into it and why. Why is it a violation? And what permits do we need? And then the next step is to notify them. And if we have to, we come to meet with them. We meet up with a, uh, sorry, we meet up with them, and I've been in these situations, it can be kind of tense. So if a resolution couldn't be reached, then we might have to go to court. And as I've been alluding to, that's the worst or the farthest we would get to, and we don't want to, um, with either like property owners or like developers or whomever to try to resolve and take it to court, which we don't want to do. And so that's where we move into meeting with violators and resolving issues. So what's the key to enforcement? Consistency. Like this is where your written administrative procedures come in. It's like you did, you know, you did something with somebody else, but I was here. It's like, no, I followed my procedures as they're written out in this published document. Like, put it down, put it in writing. And so this is a crazy story, which I don't even know what community it is, and I don't need to know. Basically, the uh, county clerk was the floodplain administrator, and the guy would not come into compliance with the floodplain regulations, and she got upset and she just went out and shut his water off. Like she just shut it off unless he like came into compliance, which in this case was to move storage material from the front yard. And he could have definitely sued her for that. That didn't end up happening, thankfully. But that's not the way to do things. That's not the right way. That's why we have written administrative procedures and these ordinances. We're going to follow this e- line of procedures. We're going to follow these rules and we're going to do it the same for everybody. So we're not showing favoritism. We're not, doing anything wrong. We're going to follow the same process for every single person that we find potentially in violation of those things. I can't stress that enough. Again, maybe a police escort, or at least maybe taking one other person with you on these inspections just to stay safe, even if you're not in the wrong. Clearly, the last person that I spoke about in that last story was wrong. Like, yeah, you can't just shut off someone's water because they're not anchoring their accessory structure, but that's not the point. Uh, you know, let's stay safe. And then, of course, through experience, and not just mine, but other people in this position, when you meet with a property owner, they tend to have this type of message, perhaps. Not all of them, for sure. Um, my taxes pay your salary. I know the mayor. I know the mayor is actually one of the bigger ones. That kind of thing. But anyways, doesn't matter. We can meet with perfectly fine people who want to comply with the ordinance. That's great. We need to be professional, be on time, watch your body language. Just, we don't want to be too aggressive. We don't want to play the blame game. Like you were late and now everything's wrong, which can happen. I'm sure you all have your own experiences with this type of thing. Um, we want them to buy into the solution. Like, I'm telling you how to fix this and why it's better for you, why you're better protected from flood risk. and maybe your insurance is going to be a little bit cheaper, but you want them to buy into the solution and then explain what needs to happen very carefully, very specifically. And it's like, we have these rules, I'm supposed to enforce them, and, you can put it on us a little bit, like the state's looking at me and maybe we're auditing your program and maybe we're like, hey, you're supposed to enforce these rules for this reason. And, you know, maybe that's on us. Like, hey, the state is looking at our program and we're supposed to be following these rules. That's it. It's very simple. And, you know, I take calls from the public all the time, so that's fine. And then Steve liked to put this in here a little bit. This is kind of like I don't know, I don't know the words right now, but like if you watch a person and you follow their body language and then you try to follow their body language, I don't know. I don't know if I've ever done this, but it's kind of like a professional development type technique. If you follow someone else's body language and you kind of like follow that, it could work. It could help. I don't know. If you like mimic what they're doing, I don't know. If you repeat someone's keywords and their key phrases back to them, it can kind of help them understand that you're listening and it can lead to better communication. That's as best as I can explain it. Potentially, I don't know. I think we all have our own body language in a professional meeting. Do what helps you. And then if you meet with a person, um, like in person, you can send a follow-up letter. So it's good to, I guess, if you meet with a property owner specifically to send a meeting, sorry, a meeting, a follow-up letter, a follow-up letter from the meeting, sorry, and then include the bullet point list, I would say, from the ordinance and from the things that have exactly violated what that ordinance is and how they can fix it. That's an important thing. And then of course be sure to thank them. Always thank them, be polite, and then no one can complain that you were rude to them if you're just very polite and you thank them. And then try to summarize the conversation in that follow-up letter. And then you have that written record of what was agreed to in writing. You have that documentation because, of course, you want to document everything. As I mentioned before, I'm sure you all know that I don't need to um, beat it to death, but also definitely document everything and then keep that documentation. So I guess I kind of brought this up before. Um, Sometimes people don't know, sometimes they're doing it intentionally. Are they building without a permit on purpose, or are they doing so unknowingly? And that's where the outreach comes in, because that's where I bring up this point. Do the outreach. Just, I don't know how much of a burden it is per community to be able to reach out to every citizen that's in the special flood hazard area and just be like, hey, you're in the special flood hazard area. You need separate permits for anything that you do. And I've been told by people, like, I didn't know this. I can't believe how much you can control what I do on my own land. And I'm like, yeah, well, you're at a high flood risk. So yes, we do tell you what to do, and it's not to be mean, but you're at risk. Ugh. And then sometimes the violator will start veering off of the plans that they submitted. Um, we had a situation one time where there was a ranch house on a very small lot, and they were just set up in one direction, and the one of the family members decided that they wanted the house to face a different direction, just reoriented how they face the sun. And then that ended up putting them in the floodplain, and there's like a whole bunch of issues where like there are power line issues. There the issues were crazy. Um, and then we put into the paperwork that the permit will be revoked if you don't build the plan. Um, and this is not an uncommon issue where like if a surveyor stakes out an area that's going to be built, it's not uncommon that it would be changed. And we've had another case where a property owner went out where the surveyor had staked out the the area to be built on, and he just drove the stakes into the ground where it's like, your lowest floor needs to be built to this elevation. Just drove the stakes into the ground. And then it was like now we have a low floor violation, and this was not caught until it was completely built. And that kind of thing can happen. Um, I haven't run across very much where incorrect site information has been provided, but it's mostly like construction changed after the submitted plans, where the submitted plans are completely, approved and were compliant, but then someone went out and did something weird. Um, Not usually elevations that haven't been checked. Usually people are checking them a lot, 2 or 3 times, but it can happen. It can happen. It's definitely not always the fault of the floodplain administrator. A lot, it can be an unscrupulous property owner, so that's something to be aware of. Um, Sometimes there can be deficiencies in the permit process. So, like if a citizen's not informed correctly, I mean, like someone called me earlier today to get the, you know, deal. Like, what's going on? Like, what do I need to do here? And that happens all the time. It's like the floodplain administrator doesn't know and they don't know, so they call me, which is fine. But sometimes they don't call me and then they just build without understanding the requirements. Lack of adequate local sources, including professional staff. If you don't know, please call me. And we have a lot of local turnover. So we have a lot of like floodplain administrators turning in and out just on like rotation, it seems like. But I'm always here. I mean, hopefully we're here to answer any questions. So if you ever stuck on a question, which happens quite a lot, definitely call us. Um, if you're not looking at foundation pours, I would definitely recommend doing so. I mean, hopefully you would be able to work with a developer or somebody to validate the lowest floor elevation, as I mentioned, is a requirement for our finished elevation certificate. Lowest floor requirement is that it needs to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So hopefully you'd be able to schedule a meeting with that person or the either the developer or a surveyor or an engineer, one of those three, to verify that. And then I think it could be revoked. So does the permit form state that it can be revoked? It should. I mean, I don't know if it's in our template or not, but if you look at our template, if you form a permit from our template, I think it would say that, or at least it should say that. At the very least, if you build outside of the stipulations of the permit that we've granted you, then it can be revoked. That should be a statement on there. Um, so if the problem was due to an ordinance or permitting deficiencies, please amend the ordinance. So I'm so happy to be back again helping people with their ordinances. If you have an issue or a question about your ordinance, please send it to me. Let me help. It does have to be approved by the chief engineer, but that's really through our office, and we can help you get that fixed if you think there's something wrong with it. Um, and amendments can be done really easily, most of the time, unless it's like a larger change or if it's been a long time since it's been approved and changed. We can definitely help with that for sure. And I've been mentioning throughout this whole training, administrative procedures, written administrative procedures. Just put it in writing, and then no one can challenge you on the process that you've taken. Like, I followed this procedure. You require permits. Issue it in a timely manner. Have a turnaround time on your permits. Provide training to staff. I mean, hopefully. I know I have some Missouri friends on here, I guess. Um, but yeah, if you require training to staff, then um that's in your procedures. And then hopefully improve communication between departments that would have to review this type of documentation for this type of development, and then make sure everyone understands the regulations, or at the very least understand that you need to look at it if it involves the floodplain. Hopefully they can read the floodplain maps, understanding the permit procedures, and then know the DWR resources, because we have our floodplain viewer, we have our letter of map change viewer, we have our state permits that also have to be um, administered. And then hopefully you would be able to read the requirements to this person. What do they need to know? What do they need to know about elevation, about flood openings in the case of an enclosure or wet flood proofing, the finished elevation certificate? It should be stated very specifically to the applicant and put in writing on the permit. And then, of course, please email us if you have questions. Hopefully you'd have written procedures, and we do have a template for that as well. Um, uh, occup occupancy certificates can be like a carrot. Like, if you don't comply with these floodplain rules, we won't give you your certificate of occupancy. So that's also why coordination with the building department can be helpful, but hopefully that would be coordinated. And then in-process inspections, I mentioned earlier, if you inspect things while they're being built, if you're meeting with people while they're being built, you probably won't run into the very expensive low floor violation, which can happen. And then, of course, we all make mistakes. Like I said, a lot of people mistake things because they don't know they're supposed to have this special permit, or that they're supposed to be elevated to a certain level, and then we end up with a low floor violation. Or we had a case where the city clerk couldn't find the permit. So there's when there was one, it just wasn't on file where it was just misfiled. So it can happen. We can't find the permit, but it actually was there, so there's always a little bit of wiggle room on the administration side. And then some people just try to ignore it. That doesn't make anything better. Obviously, people are not less exposed to risk. Um, it works for a short period, but then, we might do a community assistance visit, where we try and go and look through everything, and then we find failures to address violations. That's pretty common. It's mostly what I've run into is like city clerks that are just overloaded with other tasks that they have overlooked the floodplain issue. But it can cause much bigger problems down the road, like more than you would have thought. Um, we do have the base. Sorry, I feel like that's kind of a non sequitur. Okay. The base flood elevation portal is available. So if you have zone A's, so zone A is an approximate floodplain. It's not like a zone AE or a floodway or anything like that. If you have zone A by itself, we have a portal where you can submit requests and we will calculate it and we'll take into consideration the different reasons why you want it, why you need it, like why, if it's for new development or if it's just for informational, just depending. We do have our LiDAR estimates, so we'll we'll calculate the base flood elevation, but also provide the approximate LiDAR ground elevation, so that will give you ground elevation within plus or minus a foot, and then also calculate the base flood elevation depending on what it's used for. But we use the most conservative data, and that can give you a good indication of whether or not it's eligible for a LOMA, which is a letter of map amendment. Sorry, that's an acronym, LOMA, um, or other purposes. But we do have that as an available resource. Um, and then this maybe a little bit more about how FEMA has changed their regulations. So FEMA now requires utilities to be at or above base flood elevation, which kind of relates to the last slide, but basically, they were getting a lot of insurance claims based on utilities like this that were on the ground. So you can see the high water line on this one. So the base flood elevation is supposed to be the standard, so it should be at or above that level. And it was costing them a lot of insurance claims, as I mentioned. And right now, the government shut down, so people can't make or renew policies. But there is, when we get back to normal, there are machinery and, that kind of um, machinery and equipment. If it's elevated, um, you can get discounts on those policies. So if you have an elevated um, AC or furnace or heat pump, that kind of stuff, if it's at least above the particular level that it's supposed to be at. So I don't feel like I need to go through all of this, but it's like if it's above the floor. So like if you have a one floor house, if your machinery and equipment is elevated to the attic, if you have a basement, if it's above the basement, or an elevated on posts and piers, if it's at that floor at least. there's supposed to be a discount, but it's not really put out there exactly how that works. But there is a 5% discount if you have a compliance enclosure, that's also discounted. And just a little bit more about insurance. These are all the things that go into it, even though it's not super clear what all goes into it. FEMA mapping, NFIP policy, catastrophe modeling, etc. So there's kind of a black box around that it, isn't super explanatory how that works. And then I'll just a little bit more about violation. So like you can see how this could be a structure that is in violation. Um, so we have a manufactured home that then had this addition put on laterally, but it's not exactly clear, how this is working, like how it's connected, and it's more than likely a violation of different departments, so it's clearly not up to code. Um, and if it's like 50% or more of the market value, it's a substantial improvement. So it clearly is, but it doesn't really comply. And manufactured homes in particular are easier to cross that limit. So that's an example. Um, I just skipped a couple of slides. Um, and as I mentioned, like insurance really depends on the foundation type. Uh, so you have like your at grade, you have basements, then you have a crawl space, and then elevated without piers, piles of posts. So it's basically a house that's completely elevated. Then you have a foundation that's like partially elevated, and then you have one that's like completely. So this is adapted from the elevation certificate, the different types of foundations. So I just wanted to put that out there, I guess. As far as structural, the types of foundation are really what makes it. Um, that's really what seals the deal. What dictates what's compliant and what's not. And then we have statute of limitations to consider. So we don't need to really read through all of this. It's mostly like 5 years is as far as we go back, and that coincides with how far we go back in our, um, if you want to call them audits. We don't go back further than 5 years just because, you know, this could be an issue. And we've run into issues that were definitely more than 5 years, like things from the early 90s or like the late 80s or mid 80s, things like that. We don't worry about them. We just kind of document them, and it's not part of our compliance stuff. Um, yeah, we don't need to go much further into that. Variances. This is something that comes up a lot. People who want to award themselves a variance to resolve a violation that they created. So that's very much a part of what happens with variance requests is that people just have a violation and then they're like, oh, well, you can just give me a variance and that will fix it. And that's not quite how it works. And this kind of comes at the intersection of regulations and insurance. This is how FEMA variance, or sorry, how FEMA views variances is that it's supposed to be for a piece of property that is not personal in nature. So it has nothing to do with the property owner. It has nothing to do with their situation or their financial situation or what they think will look good as far as aesthetic considerations, that kind of stuff. But we have to look at this. We have to look at public safety, public expense, victimization of the public, that kind of stuff. That's what's important. So what gets brought up a lot is property value, inconvenience, circumstances of the property owner that has nothing to do with the land. Financial return, as I said, aesthetic, um, or a violation that they created. So FEMA considers variances valid based on the property alone. What's wrong with this lot that it cannot um, coincide, that it cannot um, be in compliance with our floodplain regulations? Why not? That's all that they look at, and there's a whole guidance manual on issuing variances in the floodplain from floodplain rules. But if it's issued, the community notifies in writing that the structure is at an increased premium rate and that it risks life and property. And that's going to remain on file with all of the variance actions, which is like the requests, the grants, the meeting, and this notification. And of course, we can joke around. We will send them with a snorkel life jacket and swim fins, but also, like, yeah, we can joke around about it, but um, sometimes a variance is appropriate for a functionally dependent use, which is like a building that has to be in close proximity to water, or an agricultural low risk building. And I talked about this a lot like last week. So if you want more training, definitely we have all this recorded. But yeah, it could be that it's more risk. It could be higher insurance. So you want to keep all of that documentation for sure. And this is a official documentation from FEMA, variances in the NFIP. Please check it out. Um, Potentially variances could draw attention to, like, if the community was perpetually um issuing variances, then it could potentially draw attention, but that has not been my experience. And then sort of um we at the state are kind of watching this, so that's what this thing is about, but not typically where sorry. Again, we're only just here to help you. We're not like being vigilant in that way, not menacingly. And again, the uh, worst case scenario is you go to court. If the applicant goes to court, if they deny that, and then I don't know, there's this whole due process. I'm sure you're familiar with the legal process that could draw out for, months at a time. Um, that's the worst case scenario, as we said. And again, please make sure that you're keeping good documentation. This is an example of not good documentation. We want to hopefully have it um, electronically and then have it backed up somewhere else. And we had a case where a floodplain administrator came in, a city clerk, and she was great, but then she like tried to clean everything out and she threw away all of the flood documents. So if you have to go to court, be prepared, review all of the documentation, obviously dress appropriately, turn off your phone. And then of course, this is just, being testified in court. Speak clearly, think before you speak, don't argue, be honest, etc. So this is just like regular if you're testifying in court stuff. Your handwritten records could be challenged potentially. Um, so I'm sorry, I know we're over time. I'm sorry. A notice on deed, basically, if you have a violation that you cannot get resolved, there is the option to put a notice on deed. And so that stays with the property forever, that you put on paper that, hey, this thing is in violation. And that way, future property buyers will see that. And that's a little bit different from the FEMA 1316 designation that basically they just can't get flood insurance. But a future property owner might not see that until they buy the property. So that's why we prefer, or we um, say notice on deed first. Exactly. So it's most commonly used where there's a violation, and then it's recorded against the building. And again, it informs any future owners, so it gives them an incentive to fix it, because if they want to sell it, then future owners are going to see this. That's the economic incentive, and then recommends that property be covered by flood insurance. So this is what that might look like. Potentially, every community is different. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. One last thing to consider, a community can be held liable for not enforcing their adopted floodplain regulations, whether adopted or not. And that has happened. Communities of people have held their communities responsible for not doing that. So that's an important part of this. Maybe this should have been 2.5 hours. Okay, I am so sorry, everyone. This is our last poll question. This is the end of the class. And if you want the two CECs, please answer this if you want to launch that. Anyways, this is my oh, sorry, my contact information. Um, thanks, Keegan. Wait, there should be another question that's like a knowledge check one.
Yeah, do you want me to do that one once this one's done being answered?
Oh, sure, yeah.
And there was also one question that I didn't know if you answered. I guess I missed it in the chat. Cynthia had a question about uh, what if you figure out a previous owner did development that put them in the special flood hazard area, but it wasn't caught at the time? Did you address that?
Nope, I don't think so.
Sorry about that. I thought that you
Oh,
had.
no, you're good. Yeah, that's difficult. Um, might need to talk offline. So a previous owner did a development that put the new person and that put that property in the special flood hazard area.
Okay, she said that she's okay with talking offline. Um, are you ready for the other poll question after the CFM? It looks like it's been answered.
Okay,
Okay, here
yeah,
are the results of that one.
cool,
And then here is the, oops, here is the other poll question.
cool. Yeah, so you guys don't have to get this right. You just have to answer any question so I can give you the certificate. We can probably stop recording too.